Yeah, we're now live on YouTube, Chair.
Great, thank you. So I think we can I can see most of the people we should have. If we've got any late joiners, that is fine. As it's gone past, we'll crack on. So welcome everybody to the 9th meeting of the Climate Change, Environment and Growth Executive Advisory Panel. We've got a busy agenda ahead of us. Just like to quickly thank Councillor Lawman, who's also in attendance, owing to the matters we'll be discussing falling under his portfolio. So we will go to the first item on the agenda, which is apologies for absence. Have we received any?
Yeah, Chair, I've received apologies from Councillor Jan O'Hara.
Okay, thank you. Item 2 is members' declarations of interest. So do we have any declarations of interest? Shaking of heads, so we'll move on from that one. Item 3 is the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of January. I hope you've all had an opportunity to read through the minutes, and if we have and we're content, we'll accept those minutes unless anybody says otherwise. We'll look pretty content at the moment, so that's good. Okay, so we're going to crack on with the first substantive item on the agenda, which is a progress update in relation to air quality. Quite rightly, this panel has shown a lot of interest in the matter of air quality in Northamptonshire. And as promised, air quality is coming back today. Going to have an officer, is it Amy, to take us through this? Perfect. Okay, so Amy, I shall hand over to you for the report. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Pentland. Morning, everyone. I think I last came to Climate EAP back in October, where I presented where we were with air quality then and shared with you all the sovereign annual status review reports. Since October, we've had 4 of those reports appraised now from DEFRA. We're still waiting for feedback for Corby and Wellingborough, but we've had Kettering and East Northampton's reports appraised. We've also taken your advice and appointed an external consultant, ACON, who's also reviewed these 4 reports, and I'll introduce you to him in a minute, and he can go into a bit more detail on the review of those 4 reports and the recommendations he has and what we can do going forward. In terms of my report, I just wanted to basically highlight a few things, asking for you to consider the recommendations as follows: that we continue with our arrangements to monitor air quality as we have been in the 4 sovereign areas, to endorse the consultant's reports, and to also endorse the project outline plan that we've put in place for the public health funding that we were successful with, which I'll come on to in a minute. We continue to monitor air quality as we have been in the 4 sovereign areas, but we have aggregated our work and our resources so that we'll have one reporting mechanism for this next financial year. We'll continue to have 17 tubes in Corby, 33 in East, 39 in Kettering and 11 in Wellingborough, and in Appendix B of this report outlines where those tubes will be. There have been recommendations for additional tubes, which we can come on to later, but we'll continue to analyse and report as we have been. And then the review of the actual air quality work itself from the external consultants in large basically recommends that we carry on as we are, but he has identified that we are meeting our statutory obligations. We don't need to declare an air quality management area, and that the concentrations have shown a decreasing trend over the last 5 years. I think it's important to highlight that. The review work that was undertaken did provide some recommendations, so that we need to submit our annual status reports on time next time for DEFRA to get them appraised on time. And I think there was 2 of us that were unable to do that, and I think that was largely down to the impacts of COVID, and some of us were diverted onto COVID work during 2020. He's recommended that we do extend our diffusion tube network to include a few more areas. We work in closer collaboration with public health, and we've done that this year already. We've already been consulting with our public health colleagues and asking for their inputs, and that we review our local air quality actions. And that will be part of the project plan that we've put forward and that the ACON report has put forward as well. So moving on to the public health funding, we were successful with a bid last December time now. We put a bid in for some money and we've been awarded £80,000, which will be utilised to recruit for 2 air quality project officers, which is much needed because we do have a limited number of resources within environmental protection across the north. So once we've received this funding and recruited these 2 air quality project officers, we will undertake further air quality work across the north by looking at different measures and innovations, which will include working with partners such as VOI to publicise more sustainable methods of transport, looking at any other grants and funding available so we can work with the taxi trade to look at switching to more electric vehicles, producing further bids with DEFRA to do more air quality grant work, raising more awareness nationally through campaigns and working with education partners, etc., to campaign against idling at schools through events such as National Clean Air Day, encouraging businesses and employers to adopt cycle to work schemes, looking into enhanced street cleaning and practices to reduce particulate matter, reviewing all of our existing smoke control areas and liaising with planning to adopt the East Midlands Air Quality Network documents as a supplementary planning document so that we're consistent and harmonised across the north. From my report, I think it's fair to say that there are no significant resource or financial implications at the moment. We are able to do what we've set out to do with the resources that we've got, and with this funding that will help to implement some of the projects that I've just outlined. There are no significant risks other than to, obviously, if we were to stop doing this altogether, we wouldn't be meeting our statutory obligations under the Environment Act 1995, but we will continue to monitor air quality. There are no other significant impacts. So I think I'll hand you over to Max now, if I may. You can go into more detail on the review report that he's carried out. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Amy. Firstly, just to introduce myself, my name's Max Nancaro. I'm a principal consultant at ACOM. I've been doing air quality in various guises for about 9 or 10 years now. And one of our jobs at ACOM is to appraise on behalf of DEFRA all of the reports that are submitted by local authorities across the UK. So I, for my sins, end up reading a vast majority of the reports that are submitted across the UK. So that puts us in a really good position to be aware of and really have a finger on the pulse in terms of best practice and what other local authorities are doing with regard to air quality. So that in mind, Amy kindly commissioned us to undertake a review of the ASRs and air quality in general in the 4 sovereign areas, as she's mentioned. So I'll just go into a little bit of detail about what we did, how we did it, and then you've already heard sort of the summary, broad conclusions from Amy there, but I'll just reiterate those and expand on them a little bit. So what we tried to do was to summarise both the standard of the reporting and air quality itself. So there's almost 2 different work streams there. It's evaluating air quality and the pollutant concentrations that have been measured, and also how that's being managed or has been managed by the 4, what were the 4 local authority areas previously. So how we did that was we came up with a scoring matrix whereby we would basically give 1 or 0 depending on various metrics, so number of monitoring sites that have been undertaken, things like the number of exceedances, so the number of high concentrations, the quality assurance and the quality control of the data, action plan measures, so things that are being done to improve air quality, and then various other metadata type metrics, such as what additional information has been provided, whether the report was submitted on time, and also for last year, which was somewhat of a unique period, as with most things in life, obviously COVID-19 has had a massive impact on both air quality and the resources available to manage it. So that was another interesting aspect. So I'll just run through briefly how we then scored each one of the areas in turn. So the metrics were out of 12. So bear that in mind as I'm going through. So we scored Corby a 6 out of 12, generally pretty good. There were no AQMAs, diffusion tube monitoring is undertaken. There were no exceedances, importantly, so no exceedances of statutory objectives, which is great. As Amy mentioned, NO2 trends, which is the pollutant that has been monitored, are decreasing in the last 5 years, and there were some action plan measures. Where marks were failed to pick up were in things like the impact of measures and how regularly these have been updated. So our view was that these were perhaps some historic data that hadn't been regularly updated, again, partly because of COVID-19, I'm sure. And there was no sort of additional monitoring beyond the NO2 diffusion tube monitoring that's undertaken. Moving on to Kettering, that was scored an 8 out of 12. So similar kind of metrics, but picked up some further scores in the description of COVID-19 impacts and the fact that it had been submitted on time and had already been appraised by the time that we looked at it. So it's just a speedier feedback mechanism, and you can have greater confidence in the report when that appraisal has been undertaken. East Northamptonshire, similar to score, so that was a 9. Again, similar kind of problems and issues and positive notes as well. So again, we really, the main constraint with this one was that we thought that the measures that were targeted at improving air quality perhaps hadn't been updated as regularly as we would have liked to see. So that's definitely a take-home message. Finally, Wellingborough, that was scored an 8 as well. So again, similar kind of issues, no AQMAs, a diffusion tube network, but nothing beyond that. And then no exceedances and a decreasing trend in air quality. Are there any questions on that before I sort of move on to summarising? Or
Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask if I'm allowed, Max, since you say you review a lot of figures from other councils, how many councils actually measure particulate matter, which is a recommendation that has been put to us to measure particulate matter?
Yeah,
So,
it's a good question. The answer to that is not that many. Where PM monitoring is undertaken, it tends to be centrally funded. So there's a thing called the AURN, which is the National Monitoring Network. So that's funded directly by DEFRA, because the reason being that NO2 monitoring, certainly by diffusion tube, is very much cheaper and easier to do. So a lot of local authorities focus on that, and understandably so, particularly as that was also the pollutant of primary concern in recent years. Really where the recommendation for PM monitoring comes from is in the update to the Environment Act that's just been enacted. So we think that it's not actually enforced yet, but we think that there will be a further objective, or at least a tightening of the objectives for certainly PM 2.5 and possibly PM 10, perhaps coming through the latter part of this year or into next year. So it's really about teeing yourself up to be ready for that if that does occur. And also it is still a statutory objective. So it's interesting to know what's going on from that perspective as well. But yeah, it is very much funding dependent, unfortunately, as most things are.
Thank you.
Okay, so those were the scores that we said. So as I say, very similar across the board, really, in terms of the strengths and weaknesses. Corby was a slightly lower score, but this wasn't really a concern. It wasn't anything, ridiculously wrong being done. the reason why it slightly dropped off on our scoring matrix was because there was a slightly higher impact from COVID-19 in terms of what was being done than in the other authorities, or certainly that the other authorities reported. So yeah, as I say, that was just part of our metrics, so it fell down a little bit on that one. But in summary then, the overall strengths of the ASRs themselves and in local air quality generally is that none of the local authority areas have any declared AQMAs, and we agreed with that conclusion. So we didn't think that there was currently any need to do so. All of the local authorities currently undertake or undertook NO2 diffusion tube monitoring, which is great. Again, that's not always done, but it is done quite often by local authorities. But it obviously gives you a lot more information about what's going on in the local area. There were no exceedances last year, with the caveat being obviously that COVID-19 has had a big impact on pollutant concentrations across the country. Anecdotally, we've seen generally about a 20 to 25% reduction in NO2 concentrations in 2020 versus 2019, related to, not totally related, but certainly related in part to obviously the restrictions in activity that occurred earlier in the year, certainly. Again, as Amy picked up earlier, there's generally a decreasing trend in NO2, which is great and is reflective of the national trend. And we were happy with the QA/QC procedures, so the quality and assurance of the data itself. Common themes for improvement. As I said, we recommended the additional monitoring, such as for different pollutants or potentially extending the existing NO2 network to some additional sources or to points of exposure of concern. We recommended an update to the measures that are being undertaken. So important to state there that from a statutory perspective, because there are no AQMAs and no exceedances, there's actually no specific requirement on the reporting side, certainly, to have specific measures that are improving air quality, because how the legislation works is it's very much tied to an exceedance. But obviously, aspirationally, it's still great to be improving air quality as far as we can, because there's the scientific sort of underpinning to that is that there's no safe level of pollutants. So we need to try and work towards that if we can. But anyway, we thought that it was worthwhile updating those measures and taking the chance to review them holistically. And yeah, just reprioritizing them post COVID-19. You know, we tried to review it in light of the fact that obviously COVID has had a really big impact on resourcing across the council, I imagine, and certainly in air quality. So it's just about refocusing that as we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic now. As has already been mentioned, we recommended sort of trying to submit towards the recommended deadlines, and then that's really just to give you more feedback and more timely feedback, so that if any recommendations are made from the appraisal, that those can be implemented ready for the next reporting year, rather than you know, if you get your appraisal back later, it's harder to then implement any recommendations that are made. And again, as was mentioned earlier, we recommended sort of a greater collaboration between sort of the relevant public health authorities within the council and any sort of pollution working groups. And I think, you know, the amalgamation of the four authorities into one for the purpose of LAQM certainly is a really good opportunity to do that and, you know, learn from each other in terms of best practice, you know, what's been going on, what hasn't been going on, and any beneficial sort of learnings that you can undertake from those. I won't go into this in a great deal of detail, just conscious of time, but we also recommended some additional monitoring locations, specific sources and specific locations that we thought might be of interest. But again, I'm sure that's somewhat budgetary dependent. But as I said, there are some recommendations within that report which can be taken forward. Again, important to note that from a statutory perspective, there's no obligation to monitor. So any monitoring that you are doing, I guess, is seen as additional to that. So it's not as though the recommendations that we made are obligatory. It's just that it would improve the information that is available on air quality. So that's all I really wanted to say. I'm happy to take a couple of questions now, or if we have time, if you have any.
Thank you, Max, for going through that. And it was really useful to have the. Can you hear me well enough on this? Yeah, sorry. It was really useful to have the detailed reports to go through. I'm really grateful to you, Max, and Amy, to you and your team across the council for bringing this all together and bringing it back. It was useful to read through for the different areas and look at the recommendations for how we can improve things going forward. And it was also good to see, obviously, that we didn't have any AQMAs needed for the area, but of course there are things that we can do which have been set out. So we've had some hands go up. Councillor Bone, yours was up first.
Thank you, Chair. I welcome the report, and I echo the Chair's comments, Mr. Nancaro, but on page 60, it's just a matter of semantics, really. I'd prefer that the NNC should read NNC should. I think we should be more proactive and positive rather than could take your recommendations. I think we should. And in particular, just the small matter of the number of diffusion tubes, for instance, Wellingborough, sort of 11 compared to some of the other previous sovereign areas. So that was just my point of just being a bit picky, really. Thank you.
Yeah, just on that point, really the language was chosen for the reason that I've just mentioned, in terms of it's not necessarily an obligation. So, I think we're happy to update that if that's preferable. I guess we can speak to Amy about that afterwards. But, from my perspective, the recommendations that we make are for you guys to take forward or not at your discretion, really. So if you think that it should be a should, then that's great from my perspective, I think.
Thank you, Councillor Bone. Certainly take those on board. Councillor Dell.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a few comments / questions. I'm not sure if they'd be better for Max or for Amy, but I wanted to thank you both for the work on this. It's really, really good to see. First off, I know it's in all of the different, there's the recommends additional monitoring around schools as kids are more vulnerable. I was just wondering how much more vulnerable they are. I know obviously that exhausts are closer to children due to their height, but how much more vulnerable are they? And obviously the recommended levels of 40 for NOx. But would the monitoring need to be less for around schools, or is that just the standard? Answer that first, if that's all right.
Two questions there. From the perspective of whether children are more vulnerable, the answer is because their lungs are still developing, they're that much more vulnerable to the pollutants. So, things like childhood asthma and things have been shown to be related to air pollution. And it's certainly something that which is partly where the recommendation came from. It's certainly something that the London boroughs are doing quite proactively, is monitoring around schools to understand what pollution is available, or not available, what is occurring in those areas, and B, what potentially they could potentially do about it. I'm sure many people on the call would know better than I. The school run is one of the areas where pollution occurs because of people parking close by, or dropping off their kids, etc. So it's partly around that as well, is targeting particular emission sources and emissions profiles. Your second question around the objective, that remains the same regardless, certainly for LAQM. There's a lot of conjecture at the moment around whether the more stringent WHO guidelines will be transposed into UK law. At the moment, that doesn't seem to be happening, or won't seem to be happening, certainly for NO2. But again, it's whether the council looks to go aspirationally beyond that and try to continue to improve, or whether we stick to the statutory objective and say, okay, we've achieved that. You know, we don't think that there's additional measures that need to be undertaken, really.
Thank you. One of the other questions I had was the mentions about automatic continuous monitoring quite a few times. I understand that's more expensive. I was just wondering how much more expensive it is, because obviously that also measures PM10 and PM2.5, which it's still, I know we're moving towards EVs, which is why partly one of the reasons that there's less NO2. But of course, PM10 and PM2.5 still come from brake discs and things like that, so they're still existing on EVs.
The answer is it's quite a lot more expensive. You can run a diffusion tube survey depending on the number of sites you have for a couple of grand a year. It takes around about, depending on what you're doing and where you're putting it, around about 30 to 40k, I would say, to install a continuous monitoring site. And then you've got higher running costs as well in terms of electricity, whether you have any sort of rent that you need to pay on the site, or other things like consumables and a gas calibration cylinder that you need for continuous sites. So the answer is it's very much more expensive, which is why there's far less of them around. And they're also a lot more difficult to install. I know from personal experience, it can be a bit of a pain to get these things in and to then look after them once you've got them. But the benefits are that they do give you a higher resolution of data. So the diffusion tube, you get a snapshot of the month basically, whereas a continuous site, you can get, you know, up to 15-minute, 10-minute, 5-minute readings if you're interested in that. And you can also monitor more pollutants. So again, it depends a lot on budget, whether those things are done often.
I think in addition, can I just add, sometimes it does involve, doesn't it, Max, digging up pavements and getting various permission off highways.
Yes.
Cleaning them and collaborating them every month, and obviously linking them into the council's ICT systems as well. So all that would need to be scoped out if it was to be considered.
Yeah, there's a fairly significant lead in time to getting them in, as you say, for that particular reason.
Thank you. I've got another question that's maybe more for Amy, actually, so as you're muted. It mentions a couple of times about a county-wide pollution group with linking with West Northampton. Was there anything like that in existence before the unitary split, or is that going to be looked at, do you think? Or?
The county-wide pollution group, did you say?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, there is an environmental protection subgroup, a pollution group. That's been in place for a number of years now, and that still is in place. They meet 4 to 6 times a year, and it's all the EAP officers across Northamptonshire that get together to discuss things like air quality and other areas of environmental protection, to share best practice and to ensure that we're harmonising. And we are already looking at the planning conditions, for example, and harmonising documents such as the SPD. So that group does very much exist and work well together, so that we're working the same way. Yes,
that's fantastic to hear. That's great. It did mention in the report about repositioning some of the tubes, especially in Corby. Will that work be carried out?
We'll certainly review that. We did change a couple of the tubes back in 2017. So we'll take the recommendations from this and consider whether we need to put in any additional tubes. Obviously, certainly the discussion around putting them at schools will be explored through the air quality project officers that we'll recruit to. But the cost of tubes, as we've said, isn't actually hugely expensive compared to continuous monitors. So it won't be done within this reporting period because we've already started, but we will, every year we review our tube locations. So it's something that we could implement from January and look at the additional tubes. Certainly, as Corby's a growing town and there's new locations to be considered. So yes, it will be reviewed.
That's brilliant. And because I did notice there was quite a lot of recommendations for additional monitoring.
There were specific recommendations, wasn't there, on certain roads? So yes, we'll look at that in December to implement it for January. The additional cost for 3 more tubes in those 3 specific sites that were recommended by Max would be probably about £150. So yes, we're likely to implement those. Yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Just 2 more things. One, I noticed in the East Northants report, it mentioned about not burning waste, which obviously can cause a lot of pollutants. I know that this is more of a comment. There've been the green waste bin consultation, which will be going out shortly. Is there much of a correlation between, is there any history of, like, if charges are brought in, that there is more burning of waste? That is a question.
I mean, obviously, yeah, the green bin collection. Obviously, if we change that, and there's always that danger if we change any council services. I mean, that's another part of environmental health that officers do. We do deal with investigations of garden bonfires and domestic waste fires. I mean, it's hard to. I wouldn't be right to correlate that and say specifically there would be an increase in burning of waste if we reduce the garden services collection, but there could be. I mean, it's hard to put stats against that, but hopefully not. Hopefully most residents would take a pragmatic and sensible approach to their waste.
Okay, and finally, how exciting is it that we've got some air quality project officers? That money from public health, it's fantastic. That 80k, is that a one-off like capital expenditure? Is that going to be ongoing? Because obviously hiring 2 officers, is that like for a year, or is that going to continue?
It is, yeah, it's a one-off at the moment. It's a lump sum. It's £80,000. It's a lump sum. So we're hoping that it will fund 2 air quality project officers for 12 months. But what we want them to do is look for other funding sources so that we can continue with that. So they won't be permanent members of staff on the establishment. They will be project officers that will recruit in externally, but certainly one of the top things on their list will be to explore other funding pots, because it would be useful to keep them going long term, certainly to keep these projects going beyond the 12 months.
That list of projects and innovations is a very exciting list. And
it is, yes, it is, certainly.
Yeah, so thank you so much for all your work on that. Thank you, Max, as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Councillor Dell. Some really pertinent questions as ever. Councillor Lee.
Very quickly, Chair, thank you. The recommendation to work together with Public Health England seems an absolute must to me. Is that something that we can please take on board? I mean, can we as a panel insist on that? Because to me, it stands to reason that if a county-wide pollution group exists, that our officers work together in the context of a joined-up government with Public Health England, because Public Health England will remind us of the reasons why monitoring air quality is so important.
Yes, I think I was meant to say it's public health. It's with public health colleagues within the council actually that we're working with at the moment, but we'll certainly reach out and contact Public Health England as well. I mean, public health practitioners that work for Northamptonshire Council already will be closely working alongside Public Health England anyway, but that is certainly something we consult with them every year anyway, so that's certainly something we can do, yes.
Thank you. I can't see any other hands up. Again, just reiterate the thanks for all the work that's gone into this. As council have said, there's really good recommendations in there, and it'll be really good to see how this work develops over the coming months, particularly as an entire authority. So I'm really pleased that we've been able to look at this in such detail. If members are happy, we'll take the recommendations. Councillor Bone, your comment regarding the semantics, could you just remind me whether that was in relation to the recommendations?
It's on page 60, Chair, rather than could, should, if possible.
Well, happy to take that recommendation, slight amendment to the recommendation. So I'm going to assume that we're all going to be happy unless I see someone waving and shouting. Okay, looks good. So we will move on to, we've got Ian Smith, hand's gone up.
Yeah, just to sort of reiterate, Chair, there isn't a problem with that amendment to the recommendation. I guess the issue that we just need to understand is basically what the budget implications might be of that. In obviously we can fund the existing scope of activity, and we could probably fund some expansion of the current NO2 monitoring network without too much impact in relation to current budgets. But once we get into the realms of potentially considering further automatic monitoring, of which you've been given some indication of the costs, that wouldn't be something that we'd be able to fund within the current budget scope. We'd have to be looking for alternative funding either from within the council or externally. And I think, as Max has indicated, given the fact we aren't an area where we've got poor air quality, we haven't got any air quality management areas, we're unlikely to get any such funding from the government directly from DEFRA. So we'd be looking to potentially utilise other pots of funding that might be available for that purpose. But that doesn't mean so we can't explore that. That just might mean it would be more difficult to implement any significant expansion in terms of the range of pollutants we're currently monitoring.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And yeah, let's go away and explore these things. Certainly taking on board what's been said here today, and look at where we get to. Thank you. Okay, so item 5 on the, I can see Graham waving, but I think he's talking to someone else. That's
Hi.
fine. Did you want to come in here, Graham?
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, somebody did come in and start asking me questions. I had to explain that I was on a call. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. So you'll recall last year we came in and gave an update to the group on the local cycling infrastructure and walking infrastructure plans. And obviously there's a lot of interest in this, which is great. And we welcome that interest. And we thought it was a good opportunity to come and give you a further update on it. So I'm going to pass over to Esme in just a bit, and she can take you through the presentation. The intention with the presentation is to give you an update on where we are with the various different LC whips, as they're commonly known, so that you know where we are in the various different areas, because they are working on a phased approach, simply because we need to spread our resourcing, obviously, so that we can ultimately have an LC whip for all our major areas, but we can't do it all in the same timeline. But also the presentation, the intention for that is just to explain to you a little bit more about the process that the teams go through in order to arrive at a final plan. And as Esme will, I'm sure, explain, it's a process that the Department for Transport have laid out. And the Highways Authority for the former county were involved in the early pilots of this. So we are ahead of some of our other highways authorities across the country. But it's quite an involved process with a number of different steps. And I thought it would be useful for members to understand that a little bit more, so that they can understand the process we go through, but also how they can engage with it and how their residents can engage with it as well. So with that, Chair, I'll hand over to Esme, if that's all right. Esme, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everybody.
Thanks.
Yeah, are the slides available? Please.
Yeah, I'll share them now. 1 second.
Thank you.
Thanks, Raj.
Yeah, so I think as Graham said, yeah, I'll just be giving a sort of progress update on where we are. I think the last time we came was back in August. You just move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so first we'll remind ourselves of what is an LC whip, and I'll go through the sort of 6 stages of developing one, and I'll give an overview of each stage using the work we've completed on Kettering as an example, and then we'll finish with a brief update on the progress with the other LC whips in Northamptonshire, and then there'll be an opportunity at the end to sort of ask any questions. Just move to the next one. Brilliant. Yeah, so this is really just a reminder of what are LC whips. So they're a means of developing a long-term, robust and evidence-based approach to building a cycling and walking network. They can include whole towns, or they can be very focused on a particular area, but importantly, they identify a prioritised list of cycling and walking improvements to be delivered over a 10-year period. And they're a very useful tool in ensuring that cycling and walking is given consideration in sort of local planning and transport policies and strategies. And they're really key to making the case for future funding for walking and cycling infrastructure. And DFT have been very clear that those authorities with LC whips are best placed to secure future funding. So yeah, ready to move on to the next one. Yeah, so in 2020, the government published 2 documents that outlined the step change in the quality of walking and cycling infrastructure that should be delivered, with the vision outlined in gear change, and the guidance being outlined in LTN 120. So essentially, they outlined that segregated infrastructure protected from traffic or traffic free and reducing the speed and volume of traffic are the main ways of achieving safe cycling routes. So that's really what we should be aiming for in Northamptonshire. So just move on to the next one. Yeah, so this slide gives an outline of the 6 stages of the LCWIP. Obviously, there's quite a bit of detail on there, but I just wanted to give you an overview of really the amount of work that goes into LCWIPs. And as Graham said, this is sort of outlined in the technical guidance produced by DFT. So we're expected to go through these different stages. Starting at the left with the sort of setting out the scope, moving on to the data gathering, and then doing the sort of site auditing and coming up with the potential improvements along for walking and cycling, and then coming up with a prioritised list for future investment. And as you can see there, it's really important to engage with stakeholders during that process. So we make sure we have a number of workshops along the way, and this is complemented by community engagement, and we've been using the Commonplace platform for that. Move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so this is, so as Graham says, we thought it'd be really helpful to go through the work that we've done for the Kettering LCWIP to give you a bit of an idea of, as I say, the detail that goes into it in the work. And as you can see, we're currently at stage 4 with the Kettering LCWIP. So we started back in September, sort of outlining the scope, etc. And we've moved through those stages. We've had one stakeholder engagement workshop, and the Commonplace platform was launched in October 2021, and that will be live until this time sort of next year, basically. Move on. Yeah, so the first stage is setting out the scope of the study, and we've basically set up a working group which is council officers alongside the consultants, WSP, the sub-consultants. They're also helping us, which is Brightways, and it's active planning. Actually, apologies for that error there. But the study extent was drawn up based on a 5-kilometre cycle distance, which you can see there. So it's including sort of Burton, Latimer, and sort of areas wider than, you know, Kettering town itself, as well as sort of nearby villages as well, to recognise the importance of linking those communities with their sort of you know, main town. And also the core walking zone, which is a much sort of smaller area based around the town centre. Move on. Yeah, so the next stage, and this is where, you know, you're really sort of getting a lot of data and looking at what the existing cycle network is like, what are the barriers. So that might be, where in the case of Kettering, it's definitely the railway line, and the in terms of sort of creating severance and kind of lack of carriageway space to sort of do cycling and walking in some areas. But it's also, you might have rivers or, you know, sort of main roads that create that severance. And so it's putting all that information together. And we've combined that with asking through the Commonplace platform for the comments using the heat map, so people can kind of put a point on the map of where they've got issues with sort of walking and cycling, and where they see that improvements need to be made. And during this process, we're also looking at where the existing trip generators are. So that's looking at where people live and where they're going to be living. So that's in terms of the local plan developments, feeding that information in. And then looking at where people are travelling to, so schools, hospitals, leisure facilities, retails, etc. And the propensity to cycle tool uses census data as a way of looking at where those trips are. So we use that in conjunction with local knowledge, because excuse me, obviously the census data is a little bit out of date now. It's the best we've got, but so we supplement that with information. So it basically comes up with some cycling and walking flows, and also kind of the real potential to increase them. If we move on. Yeah, so these maps are quite detailed, but I'm not expecting you to sort of see the detail, but it's just sort of an example of what all that data collection sort of results in. So you can see we've mapped out where all the schools are, etc. And you can sort of faintly see where the sort of the red lines, which shows where the kind of the highest sort of walking routes are. And again, sort of on the cycling side, where the main route desire lines are for cycling. So if we move on, excuse me. As I said, mentioned, we do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So the first stage of that is to actually work out who the stakeholders are. And I know some of you have been involved in the stakeholder workshop that we carried out. But really, once we've done all that data collection, it's really a sense check. You know, that's the sort of main objective of that stakeholder engagement, to make sure that we haven't missed anything. We've got the right routes toward it, and it's sort of refining them. So there was, you know, comments from stakeholders, oh, you've missed out this bit. This is, you know, there's a parallel route that could be really useful. And so it's really just gathering all that information and making sure that we haven't missed anything. And again, with the core walking zone, does it capture the right area, or, you know, do we need to extend it in particular areas? So carry on. And again, the community engagement side. So as I mentioned, we started that in October 2021. So Brightways have been leading on this work, and we've had over 1,000 contributions to that so far. And it's been a mixture of social media and sort of regular updates. As I mentioned, the interactive heat map, which allows people to make particular comments. But it's been complemented by face-to-face events with the hospital, Wicksteed Park, and we've also gone out to the town councils as well to have specific meetings with them to make sure they're up to date with where we are with the Kettering Elsewhere. And it's the Commonplace also allows you to do specific sort of surveys which you can tailor to particular groups. So as you see on there, we've done one particularly for secondary schools. And we'll be using this platform going forward for further engagement as we progress the plan, and also for public consultation once we've got a final draft report. But it also enables us to do sort of specific engagement on any schemes that we want to progress in the future. So this slide shows the key cycling and walking routes that we've audited. So the original brief was based on 5 routes, but because through the data analysis that we did and the stakeholder input, we realised that we just needed to do many more. So as you can see, there's a number of routes there, and it's a really comprehensive network that we've done. If we go on to the next one. Yeah, so this is us out there auditing. You'll see that we took our bikes, and we even took an empty pushchair, which got a few strange looks. But that was to really get a sense of how the routes were for people, and yeah, we definitely made friends with the cafe. Supermarket cafe, because we were out there for a long time. As you can see there, we audited over 25 kilometres of cycle routes and approximately 12 kilometres of walking routes. So it's a really detailed audit process. And as you can see, there's a lot of discussions on site about what sort of scheme opportunities there are, what the space is like, and, you know, generally just what the walking and cycling environment feels like as a pedestrian or a cyclist, and how friendly or hostile it feels. We move on to the next one. Yeah, so this is where the next sort of stage is the audit write-up, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot of photos to go through. And trying to get all that information down in a mapping sort of format, so that we can sort of look at the routes in different stages and look at kind of what the key issues are on each of those in terms of the existing situation, and yeah, complemented by those photos. Move on to the next one. And yeah, so then once we've kind of mapped that, it's down to kind of putting on paper what those recommended improvements are. So WSP have been working hard to do that, and we will be having sort of a working group to go through those in a bit more detail, and just make sure that you know, their thoughts kind of align with what we're thinking as well, and kind of, you know, discuss sort of, you know, make sure that everything's sort of as we expected. And we've got support from some technical support from DFT, so some sort of experts that are going to be inputting into that process to make sure that we're following LTM 120 as closely as possible. So that's really about kind of providing those segregated routes as far as possible, or etc. If we move on to the next one. Yeah, so the next stage is about prioritising the schemes. As you know, we've got a number of routes, so we need to look at which ones are going to sort of deliver best value for money. And so we've identified prioritisation criteria, and that's a mixture of quantitative sort of analysis with more qualitative side of things. So that all goes into the mix, and each sort of corridor is scored, which is in line with DFT guidance. And really the main sort of idea in terms of prioritisation is kind of through the demand that you're going to get, and kind of deliverability. That's kind of the main criteria really in terms of when you're thinking about which schemes to take forward first. But it may be that one corridor comes out better than another, but you may find that in the future you get a funding pot that is more suited to the scheme that actually came, you know, second or third down the list. So it's not a kind of ultimatum that you have to start kind of at the top of the list and work down. There's, you know, there might be a development that comes forward that might be able to deliver part of a site, part of a route, etc. So it's just a way of sort of looking at all of the corridors and just comparing them. We move on. Yeah, so in terms of the other sort of LCWIPs, so in terms of the Wellingborough one, we've had a final report which was produced by Sustrans, and they looked at 11 cycling routes and 17 walking routes have been audited. And we still need to do the stakeholder engagement and public engagement. So as I mentioned, we've got some DFT technical support, so they're going to be helping us to just review that report from Sustrans and suggest some ways that we can sort of take forward the stakeholder engagement and public engagement on that report. Move on to the next one. In terms of Higham and Rushton, so this was one of the ones that we developed a while ago as the former Northamptonshire County Council, and the scheme proposals were produced before the LTN 120 guidance was produced. So we need to go back and review those to make sure that what was proposed before now meets the LTN 120 guidance. So again, we're going to be using DFT technical support to help with that process and to give some advice on it. And again, there will need to be some more stakeholder engagement and public consultation will follow. Yeah, so that's that's where we are with the Higham and Rushton LCWIP. So we carry on. Yeah, so the final one is the Corby LCWIP. So we've issued the brief to WSP, and we're looking to commence work in early March, which is getting ever closer, isn't it? So with a view to finalising the report in September. So we're really excited to start on the Corby LCWIP because yeah, it'd be great to get another one commenced. And again, DFT will be supporting us with that as well. Yeah, so has anybody got any questions? Hopefully that was a bit of a whistle stop tour, and apologies for my voice. I'm struggling with a cold at the moment, so I hope you could hear me.
Thank you, Esme. And just quickly before we move to questions, it was really good to have that update and great to see how you're getting out there and testing the various different, auditing the various different routes. That's really good to see. So that it's certainly not just a desktop exercise, this, which is really positive. Councillor Dell, your hand was up first.
Thank you, Chair. Esme, I just want to say this is a really good update. Thank you so much for this. It's and you and the team have done a huge amount of work on this, obviously. I've got a few questions. First off, the commonplace consultation that's currently running in Kettering, is there an end date for that, or is that just ongoing?
It's just ongoing at the moment. So I think, yeah, we're just still promoting it. So the license has been extended to February 2023. So it gives us more flexibility now, so we can use it, as I mentioned, to sort of, you know, for specific public consultation, and also any schemes, because I know there's some feasibility design money in the budget, which is really positive. So once we've done, you know, analysed our priority schemes, then we can start to look at which scheme to take forward next year to feasibility design. So we can start doing a bit more sort of specific sort of engagement and sort of consultation around that specific corridor, whichever one it might be.
That was, I think you kind of answered one of my other questions, which is like when we'll actually start seeing some stuff happening on the ground and some changes being made. So yeah, thank you for that. The Hanwood Park, it's really good that Hanwood Park has been included in that, because obviously, although it's not built at the moment, it will be in the future. Is there going to be scope for working with developers to build cycling and walking infrastructure into the estate as it expands? And
yeah, definitely. I think the real benefit of having the LCWIP in place is that you can take it to the developers and sort of say, well, this is, you know, the network that we want to build. So, you know, you can use it as a negotiation tool to sort of say, you know, your part of the development needs to fit into our wider network. So it's really beneficial from that point of view. But yeah, we would be expecting developers to be designing LTN 120 compliant schemes within their developments to produce that really comprehensive network.
That's fantastic. Yeah, because I was going to say, does it once it's complete, would it then feed into planning decisions as well? Which you've just answered that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm also a Kettering Town Councillor, and Alison Holland from Brightways, and I can't remember the guy's name, but he came up from Southampton on his combination of bike and train, and they did a really, really good presentation to the town council. It was really impressive. He did mention that, this is going to form into a question, like, if there's any like potential future threats to funding, because I guess a lot of this is centrally funded, and he sort of did say, you know, if there is a change in Prime Minister, at the moment the current Prime Minister is very supportive of cycling and walking. If there is like another Prime Minister that say really loves cars, could that affect future funding, do you think?
Well, yeah, it could do. I mean, obviously there is, you know, funding that's been sort of, yeah, there's definitely a step change, you know, from government in terms of aspiration, and it's, you know, finally actually being backed up with money as well. So yeah, I think our view is that we'd want to see that continue, you know, as long as possible, because I think it really ties into the presentation you had earlier about the air quality. You know, this is really, you know, having an LCWIP in place and making sure that you know, children are happy to walk and cycle to school, and people, you know, use it for their everyday sort of shorter journeys, is really going to improve air quality, which so it's a real tool, and also, you know, in terms of you know, public health benefits as well, in terms of, you know, reducing obesity and you know, just making people more active generally. So
yeah, I did see some crossover between the air quality, like the public health funding, and like potentially working with the LCWIP as well, which is really good.
Yeah.
Finally, obviously I'm in Kettering, so really great that the LCWIP's being done for Kettering. But I did wonder about the timescales for the rest of the county. Obviously, you put up the rest of the north, you put up the timescales for Corby, but Higham and Rushden you know, you're going to review because it was previously done before the LTM 120. Are there any timescales on the rest of the north?
Yeah, it's sort of a resourcing issue, and Graham might like to sort of step in here, but yeah, it's really just sort of capacity, you know, making sure we've got capacity. So Graham, did you want to sort of add something?
I think you're absolutely right, Esme and Councillor Dell. We all see this as a priority piece of work, but there are also other priorities as well, so it doesn't stand out by itself, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending how you're looking at that. Anyhow, we don't have timeframes at the moment because we're trying to fill some resource gaps that we have within the team. So I wouldn't want to give you a date and then not be able to deliver on it. But that's not to say we're sitting there leaving it in abeyance. We are keen to progress them as soon as we can. So I can only give you that commitment that we're trying to move forward as quickly as we can. But I don't really want to give you any dates because I might not be able to fulfill them.
Thank you both.
I'm sorry for not being more more firm about it. I'm not being elusive purposely. I'm just being honest.
Thank you both.
Couldn't find the unmute button there. Thank you, Councillor Dell. Councillor Bone.
Thank you, Chair. So Councillor Dell, as usual, has reeled off a number of questions. I'm thinking he's about to say the one I was going to pose, and I think Graham has answered it, because I'm very excited as a Hine resident and a local councillor. I'm really excited about RLC WIP coming, and I understand the pressures, and so I understand you can't answer about the time frame, but I just wanted to ask Esme about the assistance from the DFT and the sort of vulnerability or the sustainability or the length or the commitment that they've given you on that. I mean, because presumably your team are leaning quite heavily and using them as a resource, and how long is that going to last?
Yeah, so they've basically outlined that they can help us with it's strategic advice, really. It's just kind of checking that what we're kind of doing is in line with the guidance, and just a critical friend, basically, because, you know, the LCWIP process, you know, though we've been doing it a while, it's still quite new to local authorities, and in a lot of cases the kind of guidance was maybe written to be more applicable to maybe very urban areas, and obviously you know, Northamptonshire, you know, there's a lot of rural sort of areas, so I think we're also learning kind of how to apply it you know, in those sorts of scenarios as well. So that's kind of you know, some of the discussions we're having with the DFT technical support. As I say, they've committed to us at the end of June. But it's really just sort of they're not doing huge amounts of work for us, but they're just kind of giving that kind of, as I say, critical friend advice to help us kind of progress things.
Chair, if I may come in on that point as well, Esme is absolutely right. Of course she is. I would just add as well that I think we are more reliant on DFT actually for the future implementation of routes. So the capital funding for the actual scheme implementation, and it's costly to do these works. You'll know from other related highway schemes that they don't come cheaply, and that's where we are very reliant on future funding for DFT. And we will be bidding alongside many other local authorities for that funding. And of course, there is only a limited pot, which is why obviously we want the LC WIPs in place, because DFT have very clearly said that there won't be funding for cycling networks unless you've got approved LC WIPs in place, which is why we're keen to get on with it and have these, as well as May said, it gives us also a good negotiation platform with developers as well. But it's more around the DFT funding for implementation that I think is a larger risk for us in terms of achieving our overall objectives in this project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee.
Thank you. A great piece of work. I'm so glad that that's happened, and I cannot wait for the cycle routes to be implemented. Just a small comment that I already gave during the stakeholder session. If the map of the Kettering map is used in a consultation, can you please just make sure that the Grange is shown in the right place? Because on 2 of the 3 maps, the Grange is shown very much in the wrong place, because otherwise it's quite confusing and it detracts from how fantastic this map is. Thank you. But this is, I'm so enthusiastic about this. So I really want to congratulate you on the piece of work you've done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just going to check if Councillor Lorman has anything he wants to add on this.
Not a lot. I'll back up what Graham just said. A bit of a word of caution that all of this will depend on funding from central government, and we'll be working. It's slightly unfortunate that all the LCUs, and I've read 2 of them, and I took part in one of the sessions at Kettering. They're all done by different people, so there's a bit of analysis there to do and a bit of coordination. Some of them are also not as well coordinated with a complete route. Some of them are bits and pieces due to the topography and areas that are involved. So there's some work to do there to make them more appealing to people rather than just bits and pieces. So there is a lot of work to do, which officers are doing. But I would support what Graham had just said. You know, we will need funding, and so you know, it won't happen tomorrow. It's a bit of management of expectations, really. But the officers are progressing, and we welcome that.
Thank you, Councillor Lorman. And I suppose the last comment from me, as with Councillor Bone, look forward to the development of the Highland Ferrers and Rushden one, particularly as a regular cyclist around the town there. So we're going to move on to item 6 now, which is an update on carbon literacy training. As we're aware, members across the council have been keen to undertake further training in relation to climate change, and we're delivering on this. Indeed, I had an introductory meeting with the named provider of training for the training earlier this week, and I believe, I'm just looking around the virtual room, I think Rob Harbour, you're going to take us through this, so I shall hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, everybody. Members may remember, because we discussed it at the back end of 2021, that we were seeking to go out and procure some carbon literacy training. That training is intended to be provided for members and as many members as possible, and also initially to a cohort of senior managers. And there's an intention thereafter from an officer perspective that we will seek to put in place some kind of train the trainer sort of mechanism to enable training to be cascaded across the organisation amongst officers. So I'm pleased to say that in January we were able to conclude the procurement exercise, and as a result of that, we're able to appoint Speak Carbon, who will be the provider of the training. As Councillor Pentland has indicated, some meetings with the training provider have subsequently taken place to try to work out some of the detail and mechanics around how, what, and why the training takes place. And as I understand it, we've got 2 dates now identified. One on the 28th of March and another on the 30th of March. They're half-day events, so one's in the afternoon and one's in the morning. And I think there's potentially opportunities for further dates to be identified as well. So there's more work ongoing in terms of trying to identify more dates than that. So the idea, the intent is that there will be 6 training sessions in total, and that will cover a total of 128 participants. So that's 78 members and 50. A cohort of 50 senior managers and potentially some other nominated staff across key service areas. So the training will be in the hands of the the provider, and they will do most of the organisation themselves. I understand that they're going to use a system called Eventbrite as a mechanism to host and provide materials for the training. So that's where we're up to at the moment. In terms of identifying dates, as I said, there are 2 dates already identified. Further dates, and I've seen a comment flash up about not all daytime training. That is in the hands of colleagues in democratic services, and they are obviously liaising with the provider. So I'm sure. I think Carol Mundy's probably in the meeting today, and will no doubt have made a note of that request from members around not all daytime training. But in any event, we'll take that into account in terms of trying to set up the other sessions. So I think that's probably in a nutshell where we are. So moving forward, initial dates already going into diaries, and I think very positive and excited to be able to roll that training out. So that, I think that's probably about all I can really say on that, Chair, but obviously happy to try and take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Rob, for that update. And just to provide some reassurance, Councillor Lee, when I had my meeting with the provider, I highlighted that we should accommodate the different timings of the day. So that's very much on both the provider's radar and hopefully now as well, I'm sure it probably already was, democratic services, because we're really keen to get as many people as possible. And just quickly, if I may, before we go to questions, just take this opportunity to ask members of this panel, I know we're a little bit light today, but ask members of this panel to really encourage fellow members to partake in the training, because that's really important in terms of driving forward this council's commitments on tackling climate change. And if we can be good advocates for it, I'm sure we'll get lots of people participating in the training as it comes forward. Councillor Dell.
Thank you. Firstly, just a comment. I'm really excited to get the training, and it's really exciting to see all the members get trained. I'll also say it's a shame that it's not happened before now, because I feel that perhaps it would have been made a difference perhaps in the budget proposals going forward, which is obviously tomorrow. Secondly, without wanting to put you on the spot, Chair, how did you find the carbon literacy training? Because I know you've undertook some.
It was really useful. Thank you. There were lots of key takeaways, and it was really useful to have the workshops looking at what we can do as individual authorities. That I suppose is the main takeaway for me. It was good to hear also what other councillors are doing across the country, because there were a number of speakers over the 2 days that we had. So all in all, it was really useful, and that's why I'm really keen, like you, that we have as many members as possible take part in it, and just really understand from a local perspective what it is that we can be doing to a greater extent. I mean, I think one of the key takeaways, little facts, was that authorities might contribute to 5% of emissions, but have influence over 30% of emissions, UK domestic emissions, which was really powerful to me in terms of what we can be doing.
That's brilliant. Thank you, and thank you for your work.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you again, Rob, for that update, and to all your team for the work that's been going on. Obviously, it takes time to procure these sorts of training in local government. So really pleased that we're now there and we've got those dates in the diary to crack on with this. Going to take this opportunity then to move on to the last substantive item on the agenda, item 7, which is an update on carbon management. I understand that it's me that's providing this update, unless, Rob, you had heard otherwise.
Well, I'm happy for you to do it, Chair, but if you'd like me to say something, then I'm happy to do that also.
You were ready to say something, then I'm assuming.
Well,
that's fine. Go ahead.
I can say something.
Go ahead, and then I'll chip in.
Okay, so I mean, members may also remember that we discussed back end of last year another procurement exercise, which was, and we talked about the scope, and I think there were about, off the top of my head, about 6 or 7 items in the scope, and part of it was sort of training related, but not a replication of the carbon literacy training that we've just talked about. But there were also other really key elements that we were seeking to procure in relation to capturing information around the work that we're currently undertaking and have undertaken over the last couple of years through the former authorities that contribute towards carbon reduction and make that positive contribution towards climate change. Also around validation of our carbon footprint calculation, and then arguably most importantly, to work with us to develop a carbon management plan that helps us to reduce our carbon footprint. Not only ours as an individual organisation, and I suppose this comes back to the point Councillor Penton was making just now. Obviously, we have got to establish a plan in terms of how we reduce our own carbon footprint as an organisation, but it is also how we influence carbon reduction across Northamptonshire, that wider area where we don't have direct control or responsibility, but nonetheless have an important role to play as a public sector leader and influencer in that respect. So we went through another procurement exercise for that. Unfortunately, the results were not quite so positive. And sadly, we didn't receive any bids for the work, which goes without saying is somewhat disappointing. We've taken some time to contact each of the suppliers that we've gone to for bids, and we had pre-warned them as well. It's worth saying that we were going out to procurement, and I think it will be fair to say there was no one particular reason why bids weren't forthcoming. So there was a whole host of different reasons, many of which didn't, to my mind, seem to make complete sense. Nonetheless, that was the outcome of the procurement. So we need to obviously take on board the feedback that we've received from each of the suppliers, which we've been doing, and I think we need to then not simply just go back to the market with the same request that we went out with before, because it is, as Councillor Pentland says, it's time consuming, and actually putting the procurement documents together is in itself a fair piece of work. So I think just going back out and doing the same thing again, I think there's a possibility it will just lead to the same result. So we don't want to do that. We need to get bids in so that we can actually procure assistance with these items of work. So I think what we are heading towards is effectively probably to break down the procurement into several smaller pieces of work that associate with each other. So, for example, the work around carbon management plan and capturing information on the projects that we are already undertaking that contribute towards that may well be a project in its own right that we'll go out and try and seek to procure assistance with, and that work around the further training and framework of engagement for members and so on and so forth. We'll do that as a separate package as well, because I think given the feedback that we received from suppliers, we probably stand a better chance of being able to procure the support and advice that we need that way. So in summary, obviously it's disappointing and something of a setback. But I think we just need to take the feedback that we've received, regroup, and actually take a different approach to trying to secure that consultancy support. So obviously that's where we are in terms of that procurement exercise, and obviously in terms of where we are with our own carbon footprint. Well, we at the moment are still in the space that we have been for some time as a brand new organisation. We don't yet have a year's worth of data as Northamptonshire Council, but of course we are fast approaching the end of year one, and thereafter we will be able in a position to start capturing the data, which will enable us to do the carbon footprint calculations and get that verified and so on and so forth, and that obviously in turn helps to then inform the carbon management plan, because clearly we need to know where we are now to understand what the trajectory has to be to get from where we are now to where we want to be. Again, I think that there's probably not a lot more I can say other than that at the moment, Councillor Pentland, but again, happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Rob, for that update. And as you said, it's disappointing that no bids came back in. I know you'll know from the discussions I've had that I think this is really key to the next steps that we're able to take as an authority. And I know, and I'm thankful to you and your team for the hard work that's been going into those procurement documents, and I'm sure that we'll get there very soon to enable us to carry on. Of course, there's lots of work going on in the meantime on all of this, and I'm pleased that we've been able to commit to being carbon neutral by 2030 as an authority. So it's just about driving forward with that at pace, and I know that we'll get there. Councillor Dell, you've got a comment you want to make?
Yes, I was just going to say it's really good to have seen the announcement this week that carbon neutral by 2030. It's great. Does that in any way relate to the carbon management plan, or like how we know that we're going to be able to meet that target?
Do you want me to pick that up, Chair?
Yeah, if you want to. Yep.
Yeah. Yes, it does. It does relate to the carbon management plan, Councillor Dell. You're quite right, and I suppose it just comes back to the thing I was saying just now about understanding what our carbon footprint is, to then understand what we need to do and the trajectory that we can then take to get down to that net zero position. So in terms of coming up with the commitment to 2030. What we've done are some estimations of what we believe our carbon footprint to be based upon the data that we're able to collect at this point in time. But of course, once we've been through a whole year's worth of trading, as it were, of existing, then we'll be able to collect much more accurate data over the weeks and months past 1st of April. And that will enable us to tighten up and I suppose fine tune that carbon footprint calculation upon which the carbon management plan will be based. But I think officers undertook a fair amount of assessment work, I think, to provide Councillor Pentland with some assurance that actually we weren't going to commit to a date of 2030 if we weren't confident that there was a way of delivering that.
Absolutely, thank you, Rob. And that was the point of having these few months to better understand where we were before making commitments. I'm pleased that we're there and that the ongoing work is in progress as we move forward. Perfect. So I can't see any other comments. So I suppose we'll move to the close of the meeting now. Thank you again, everybody, for attending, the officers for all their hard work, and to members for their valuable input as ever. We're really driving forward with this now, and I'm really pleased to see it, and I'm sure that the meeting tomorrow will further highlight our commitments towards this. On I will see you all next on